Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're continuing our best of series by looking at the best Soviet tank in the game of War Thunder. And just a quick reminder of the rules for this series: we are not using any anti-aircraft vehicles, we are only looking at vehicles in the mainline tech tree, and additionally we are looking at both the win rate and the kills death combined. So in terms of overall win rate right now, we have the T-80BVM at number 1, the T-90M at number 2, the Object 685 at number 3, the T-80U at number 4, and the T-34-1941 at number 5. Then in terms of kills per death, we have the T-80BVM at number 1, the T-55AMD1 at number 2, the T-90M at number 3, the Object 435 at number 4, and the T-34-1941 at number 5. Now, much like with the Leopard video, we don't really have to do a lot of complex math on this. The T-80BVM is the pretty clear winner with a 55.1% win rate and then kills per death on average of 1.32. Additionally, much like with the previous video, there are actually several contemporary tanks of the T-80BVM in this list as well, because as I said in the previous video and the one before that, it's pretty likely that we're going to see tanks that are at a similar battle rating clumped together, just because the success of any given vehicle does at least to some degree depend on its lineup. That being said, much like with the Leopard 2A7V, I do think this is a good opportunity to compare and contrast the various options you have for Russian top tier MBTs, because unlike the German tanks, there actually are some pretty substantial differences between the Russian ones. So the 5 tanks we're going to be looking at are going to be the T-80BVM, the T-80U, the T-90M, the T-72B3, and the newly added T-72B3A. And starting off with mobility, this is one area where you see an immediate advantage for both the T-80BVM and the T-80U. They have a beefier 1250 horsepower engine, but perhaps more importantly, they also have a noticeably better transmission. It goes up to 70 kph forward and 11 kph in reverse. That 11 kph in reverse may not seem like much until you start looking at the other tanks on this list that are capped at 60 kph forward and 4 kph in reverse, and all of them have an 1130 horsepower engine. Additionally, the T-80s have a gas turbine, so it has higher RPMs, which means it does give some more immediate acceleration. You can also tell by the horsepowers per ton that the T-80BVM and T-80U just absolutely leave the T-90 and the T-72s in the dust. It's not particularly close. The T-80BVM has 26.6 horsepower per ton, the T-72s have 24, and the T-90M is all the way down at 22.2. So the T-90 and the T-72s will feel pretty sluggish on basically all aspects, forward and reverse, not just in terms of top speed, but also acceleration and general responsiveness. The T-80s are just significantly better in the mobility area. The armor is actually where these 5 tanks actually start to get kind of interesting, because despite looking pretty similar, they are somewhat different in this area. The T-80BVM prominently features the Relict ERA on the upper front plate and also has the additional Relict bags that it can equip on the side. This gives the T-80BVM one of the more robust frontal armor profiles you can find on any of these tanks. The Relict bags in particular are actually a much unappreciated upgrade to people that aren't that familiar with top tier, because the Relict bags are actually double stacked with another set of ERA, so they provide far more protection than most people realize, especially if you're at a harsh angle. And this does mean that a T-80BVM that's angling can make itself a lot more annoying than it may appear on paper. The T-90M does prominently feature the same Relict ERA package on both the upper front plate and the side ERA bags. Now, to note, there are additional ERA plates beneath that all of these tanks have. However, not all of them have the specific Relict bags, the extra outer layer. So the T-90M does broadly have a pretty similar armor profile to the T-80BVM, and they both share a lot of the same weak points to common rounds. However, there is one pretty noticeable difference, and that's going back to the mobility. The T-80BVM, being better forward, better reverse, and also a lot more responsive, allows it to maneuver and shift its angle more efficiently, thus making accurate shots more difficult, especially when it's complicated by having those extra Relic bags on the side that are surprisingly good at absorbing shells. The T-72B3 does actually feature the Relic bags on the side. However, the upper plate only has contact 5, and because the upper front plate only has contact 5, there are quite a few common shells, especially DM53 from the L55, that can just go straight through it like a hot knife through butter. This is one of the core issues with the T-72B3 and all of the other tanks that only have contact 5 on the upper front plate. Is the more common DM53 becomes, the more vulnerable these tanks are. are, and you also see that reflected in the kills per death and the win rate, that while the two tanks that have relic armor on their upper front plate do pretty well, the ones that have contact 5 very much don't. The T-82BVM does add the Arena Active Protection system, which will occasionally save you from missiles, but it's not even really the best active protection system because it doesn't offer any protection against your primary threat, and that is to say darts. Additionally, the T-82BVM, despite technically being an upgrade, doesn't feature the add-on relic bags to the front side, so it's not anywhere near as powerful when it's angling opponents as the T-72B3. The T-80U, in terms of overall protection, ends up coming off the worst of the bunch. It does have contact 5 on the upper front plate. Additionally, it doesn't get the additional relic bags on the side. Now, another note about the T-72s, and to a lesser extent the T-80s, although this doesn't impact them as much, because the turrets are rounded and were not initially designed to accept explosive reactive armor, there are actually some minor gaps into them. These are actually pretty pronounced in the T-72B3s, and shells like DM53, if it does find one of these gaps, will go clean through it. The T-80s do kind of have the gaps, but they're not as pronounced. That is one of the areas where the T-90M does stand out above the rest, and that because it was actually designed for ERA basically from the start and has a more squared turret, the ERA plates are actually flush, so there's not any obvious weak points on the turret face. Additionally, while the T-80s do have some gaps, the composites on average are better than the T-72s, so they still tend to stand up to shells to the turret face noticeably better. The T-72s are really the ones that struggle in this area and will just get randomly pinned through the turret face by any high pinning shell that does manage to find one of those gaps. It is to an extent worth briefly shouting out the spall liner that the T-90M has. However, one important feature to remember about spall liners is that spall liners do not reduce the total magnitude of shrapnel. What they do is they reduce the outer cone of the shrapnel, and this is kind of one of those areas where Russian tanks don't necessarily benefit to the same degree that NATO tanks do, because NATO tanks tend to have more spacious interior, so reducing that outer cone of shrapnel will generally and quite often reduce the total number of crew members hit. Whereas on Russian tanks, because you tend to have a lot of your crew and ammo in a very confined space, it doesn't necessarily do as many favors for the T-90M as it does for the NATO tanks. Now, one thing that all of these tanks do have in common is that they have the fuel cells to the left and right side of the driver, and fuel cells don't generally generate shrapneling when a shell is leaving them. So if you do hit the lower front plate, or if the tank is angled and you manage to hit it in the lower side and you go through one of these fuel cells, unless the shell itself directly connects with crew or ammo, it often does very little if any damage. So overall, in terms of protection, the T-90M technically provides a little bit more protection than the BVM, although in practice, enemies will often be shooting for the exact same weak points on these two tanks, and the better mobility of the T-80BVM lets it use its fairly obnoxious armor profile to maximum advantage, whereas the T-90M can't necessarily do it as easily. The other three tanks are a lot more of a lottery, because if you do run into some of the higher penning shells, they can often click on the middle of you, and in that scenario, you are going to be at a disadvantage. Moving on to firepower, and this is where we get to an area where all the tanks are pretty similar, but yet again also ever so slightly different. All 5 of them have the exact same shell selection, and those shells have the exact same performance stats, so you don't really need to worry about that. They're basically interchangeable. However, these guns themselves do have some minor differences. The T-80U and the T-80BVM both have a 6.5 second reload, whereas the T-90 and T-72s all have a 7.1 second reload. And you might ask why this is important, and that's because in order for a Leopard 2 to get under a 6.5 second reload, they actually have to expert their crew. They can't get it with normal crew skills. So any Leopard that doesn't have strong crew skills, you will actually reload on the T-80s, but you can't out reload on the T-90s or T-72s. And it is also notable that if you do fight China, all of the Chinese MBTs currently have a 7.1 second reload, so you will out reload all of those as well. While only about a half a second in reload doesn't seem like much, it actually does hit a few breakpoints that makes the T-80s noticeably better than the other 3 tanks in this comparison. That being said, it is interesting to look at the overall gun handling. The T-90M does get an extra whopping 1 degree of gun depression, so it has 6 degrees base. However, all of these tanks actually have their hulls angled slightly downward, so in most scenarios you're not really going to have that many issues with depression, and 1 degree is rarely enough to be relevant. Additionally, the T-80s, for whatever reason, have an extra 2 degrees of vertical vertical elevation, which again rarely matters, but it is interesting to note. The most notable feature, however, is the T-80U, because the T-80U actually has the weakest turret rotation out of the lot with only 24 degrees per second on an aced crew, and it turns out all of the other 4 tanks can actually get up to 40 degrees per second on an aced crew, so actually pretty significantly faster and very noticeably so. What this means in practice is that the T-80BVM effectively does have the best gun out of the lot. It has the fastest reload, combined with the highest turret traverse that you can possibly get, and the only advantage that any of these tanks really have over it is the T-90M with its single degree of gun depression advantage. So on the whole, outside of all of these guns, you would much rather have the T-80BVMs than any of the rest. Now, before I get to any real conclusions, I do want to mention 2 relatively minor features that actually could come up in game but aren't always the biggest deal. The first one is the T-90M does actually feature a commander's thermals instead of just a gunner's thermals. All of the rest of the tanks do not have commanders, they only have gunner's thermals. Additionally, the T-90M does feature a laser warning receiver, so in some scenarios that can help you out. Both of those are situational, but they can definitely be useful. So sorting the Russian MBTs from the best to the worst, the T-80BVM obviously takes the prize. I don't think there's any real question. Statistically, it is the best, and when looking at its performance compared to the rest, it's not very hard to see why. The durability is at least as good, if not better, than basically all of them. There are some minor advantages you get in the T-90M, but not really enough. The mobility is still pretty sound, as is the gun. On the whole, it does have basically the best attributes that you could really want out of any of these tanks. Now, ultimately, which tank you put next really comes down to what you prioritize. It's either the T-90M or the T-80U. The reason I would put the T-90M potentially higher is because the T-90M does have the better armor profile, and enemies can't generally click on your upper front plate like a lot of them can with the T-80U. The only real advantage the T-80U has is the superior mobility and the faster reload, which is generally better, and the armor can still stop poorly aimed shots. That being said, I think there's a very good reason why the T-90M does rank above the T-80U in terms of its overall performance characteristics, and that's because enemies can't just click on the middle of it. So I would put the T-90M at number 2 and the T-80U at number 3. The T-72B3s I would both put basically dead last. The real question is, do you think the arena system is more useful than the relic bags on the side? My experience at top tier says the arena system isn't really that useful. Hard kill systems in general struggle to be useful because a lot of the IFVs that sling missiles are pretty inefficient at top tier. In fact, you can kind of see it in their performance stats. Very few of the top tier IFVs go positive, whereas basically all of the MBTs do. So it's not really your biggest threat, and a lot of the air launch missiles that can kill you at top tier can't really be intercepted by arena or any of the hard kill systems. So without the ability to intercept things like darts, which only really the Iron Fist can do right now, the arena system just feels like a kind of gimmicky add-on, and if you're sacrificing the side relic bags, which actually are pretty solid and can save you from quite a few shots, it really feels like the T-72B3 is the stronger pick over the T-72B3A, which is also the reason why I'm kind of curious why the B3A is higher in battle rating and also past the T-72B3 in the tech tree, but that's another discussion. But of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. What do you think about the T-80BVM and the rest of the Russian top-tier MBT lineup? Do you love them? Do you hate them? Which is your preferred? Please let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed the video, found it educational, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.